Hello, everyone. Let's wait a minute for other people to join. We will be right back. I think we are good and we can start. So hello, everyone. Welcome to April edition of our Threat Detection Highlights webinar series. Here, as you know, we are sharing the newest detection updates baked by our labs team and everything we have added to the platform, to keep up with bad actors changing and improving threats. And it's actually a special one today. It has been a full year since we started doing this monthly webinar. And not just that, today is also special because we have a guest speaker joining us. Tony is with us, Tony Lambert from Red Canary, someone with a great knowledge base and a strong community mindset. As Red Canary, they consistently share new threats, detections, and testing frameworks like Atomic Red Team, which I'm sure most of you already know and admire as much as I do. So quick about me, I'm R2. I do product marketing here at VMRay. And of course, Patrick is back with us after a break too, from our labs team. And over the past year, we have had some great conversation between Patrick, between labs, our colleagues in the product team. And we thought, why not make it even richer by bringing in guest speakers? So here we are. And actually, I would like to pass it over to our guest, Tony, now, maybe for a quick intro.
Hi, I'm Tony Lambert. I'm a senior malware analyst at Red Canary, and I've been at Red Canary for 7.5 years, something thereabouts. And before that, I used to do a lot of system administration and general IT work. So I've done a little bit of most areas of IT and lived to tell about it. And so I'm here today to have some fun. Thank you all for letting me join in.
Brilliant. Happy to have you, Tony, here. So moving on, before we take a quick look at the agenda for today, so just a couple of quick housekeeping items not to forget before we start. So this session is being recorded and we will send out the recording, the slides, and all resources right after the webinar. And feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll have some time at the end to get to as many as we can. And back to the agenda, no surprises here. We start with new VTIs, actually one VTI, an anti-sandbox detection this month. And then move into the latest YARA rules we added to the platform. And we talk about then the RATs and then malware config extraction and have a short demo prepped by my colleague Patrick. And of course, I will do my best to throw some good questions at Tony and Patrick and pull out as many insights as we can along the way. Also, I would also, speak about my once in a lifetime experience in Spain yesterday. Did the entire blackout. Not sure if it was a cyber attack, but that was unreal, really. And my takeaway is keep your good old transistor radios somewhere accessible. That would be really useful in these cases and the only way for communication. All right, so let's move on to the new VTI we recently added. Just to set the stage a little bit background information on this. Our labs team has been looking into the behaviors, especially used by the CryptBot stealer. And one thing spotted, it checks the CPU name to see if it is running on a Xeon system. So kind of an evasion trick to figure out if it is in a sandbox or a real machine. At the time, we didn't have a VTI that would highlight this behavior. So now we do. We added this new VTI. And also, the cryptbot doesn't just check the CPU name. It actually queries the exact megahertz value, frequency value the CPU is running at, and another layer of kind of discovery stage. So these are behaviors we are now detecting and tied to the, again, MITRE ATT&CK to the discovery category. And with that, actually, I will bring Patrick in for a quick comment, maybe. We already have a bunch of VTIs that look at anti-sandbox behaviors, Patrick, but you can see there is still room for more of these small checks, I think. And when you see a VTI score like 1 out of 5, it's not always something crazy suspicious, I suppose. And yeah, and anything you would add here?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we basically have those VTIs from score starting with 1 going up to 5, whereas 1 is the lowest score and 5 is the highest score. And those lower score VTIs, we basically just call informative VTIs that are intended to further enrich the analysis report that we have. The idea behind it is basically we really want to just highlight and show the whole behavior, or at least the whole relevant behavior that a sample is doing during its execution. And I mean, checking for hardware properties, like in this case, CPU model, CPU clock speed, maybe even memory or whatever, isn't something that is uncommon. We do actually see this in malicious files, but we also can see this in legitimate files. I mean, considering there's an installer basically that maybe requires specific hardware, it maybe requires a graphics card or anything like that. Those installers usually also have to check whether they are compatible with the system that you try to execute them on. But of course, in case of malicious files, usually this is a good indicator that there might be something going on, that they may be trying to figure out whether we are running in a virtualized environment or in a sandbox, as you already mentioned before. Just to maybe hide the behavior, stop, pause, doing nothing, basically to stay under the radar. And we basically added this lower scoring VTI in that case to give you more context whenever you see we analyze a sample and you see this VTI, that maybe there is something going on in the background that you maybe don't have on your mind, basically, or just to further enrich the analysis report that there is something being checked in the background.
Yeah, I think on top of that, when you have more this kind of informational VTIs lined up, probably that would be, again, raise some eyebrows,
Yes,
right?
yes, there is a specific logic behind it as well. The more discovery VTIs we see in the background, of course, specific ones, the higher the score of the sample also gets. I mean, if there is only the CPU properties being queried, that's of course interesting to know, but maybe not that scary. But if there is the whole range of system properties being queried, then of course it maybe has to ring your alarm bells already that something is going to be strange there.
Yep, amazing. All right, now let's make a killer transition to YARA rules. And I mean, basically malware plays that when you're too noisy and aggressive. And when you're trying to break it apart, that's the takeaway from this image. And usually when we talk about anti-sandbox detection, we think about VTIs. And that's still true, but this time YARA rules give us a hand too, and help us catch some anti-sandbox tricks directly. Now we will talk about. And we just added new YARA rules targeting behaviors in 2 malware families that we observed that have been pretty loud. One is Latrodectus and the other is Hijackloader. I'm going to start with Latrodectus here. So it checks how many processes are running before it executes. So if it is on Windows 10 or 11, it needs at least 75 active processes. And if it is on Windows 8 or older, it needs 50. And if it doesn't find enough, it just shuts down. And Patrick, I mean, I would like to say, how cool is that using YARA to catch anti-sandbox checks? And I know you've done some digging into the Latrodectus loader, this family. So I would like to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean we've taken a closer look into that load in the past, and I mean I think this is a very interesting technique on how they are trying to figure out whether they're running inside a sandbox or not. I mean, just basically imagine that when you have a real user system or a system that is actually used by a real world user, then you usually have a couple of different applications open, right? I mean, you have Chrome, you maybe have your mail client, you have Word, Excel, whatever you basically do, some applications running here and there. And then, of course, all of them need some processes that are running in the background. And when it comes to sandboxes, well, it always depends on how they're being built and how they're being prepared and how much effort you basically put into trying to make them resistant against evasion techniques. One of the goals that all should have in common is trying to let it look like it is a real world environment or real environment is used by a user. And that's, of course, also the reason, and I think Latrodectus really also highlights that as well, how important it is to mimic this environment. And of course, the more background process you have running, the more legitimate it looks like. And that's, of course, also what we do. And the nice on top of that is that we are also, of course, trying to catch this sort of behavior with YARA signatures. So it's even though YARA is a signature, basically, you can still try to match on patterns and code patterns to try finding this sort of logic there. I guess Tony maybe also has some additional insights and points on that to add here.
Yeah, with Latrodactus, it's been interesting to see how some of these malware families have adapted to the times. Uh, Many of you have probably seen the click fix or paste and run fake CAPTCHA campaigns that have been going in the wild. They have been going in the wild very solidly with a high volume, high prevalence since probably last November. And various malware families at various points have adopted that sort of distribution method, or adversaries distributing the malware have adopted them. And Latrodectus is one that has adopted it very, very well in the last 2 to 3 weeks. And I loved seeing new additional YARA rules to kind of help get together, figure out what those capabilities are to point to Latrodectus, because as we'll kind of talk about here, and as you'll find out as you go through and see more of this malware in the wild, those capability YARA rules will help you find newer versions. As you start finding newer versions of Latrodectus, maybe your old rules don't work, but the capability ones can still work.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also interesting because of course you can track Latrodectus itself, but it's also often interesting if you maybe see that this YARA is also matching maybe in a completely different family, that other threat actors or whatever script kiddies that you have there building the stuff in the background are also trying to adopt those techniques because they maybe picked them up somewhere, they read something about that, and I think YARA is also pretty good for that, to basically use it in that case to continue your tracking purpose, I think.
Yeah, I just stopped the screen sharing. I thought it would be a good conversation here. So I was going to just add the hijack loader, which is checking the RAM size. So that's another anti-sandbox trick. And I really like, Tony, how you put it, like capability error rules. I think we can add it to the literature. We can use it often. So with regards to actually hijack loader, I am aware of the threat detection report that your team, Red Canary, is putting together, and I think there is a kind of a mention, a highlight there around hijack loader, and I think it's kind of popping up in the environments that you monitor, right? Probably I would like to bring in right now to get more insights around that from you.
Yeah, Red Canary produces a monthly insights report where we give you kind of an idea of the most prevalent malware families that we see running in customer environments. And Hijack Loader ended up being in the top 10 for the last month because we really saw it have a pretty high prevalence. Hijackloader is one of these threats that's kind of a co-occurring threat because Hijackloader really doesn't do anything by itself. It kind of, to serve its purpose in life, it has to deliver something else. So we end up seeing it combined with other malware families nearly every time that it's run. So the only times it's not combined with other malware families is when it doesn't run successfully. And so the ones that we've seen most commonly lately, we've seen it distribute Luma in the past. We've seen it distribute most recently Eric Client 2. Other folks may call the malware Sectop Rat. They had Hijackloader and Sectop Rat combinations had a really big month in the last month. We saw that across multiple environments. And again, these were all those click fix, paste and run instances. This is something that has been high enough prevalence that across all of our customer environments, those paste and run clusters of activity have been hitting the top 10 consistently every month. And to give you an idea, we have customers across pretty much every industry you can think of outside of some federal government things. And so we have customers in different areas of the world. Different areas of the world are affected. Different industries are affected. This isn't something that's necessarily targeted, but it's something that affects everybody. And seeing all of that prevalence and seeing kind of wide distribution really hammers that home.
Yeah, which I think, especially when it comes to this paste and run delivery change or paste checking or click fix, how they have been, I think, called in the past, or it's still a couple of different names out there from them. I think it's really interesting because when we have seen this for the very first time, which I think was at the end of last year, I was really super surprised by the technique. I mean, it's super simple, it's really straightforward, and it heavily relies on the user's interaction with those pages. And I really thought at the time when those attack chains started that, well, I mean, well, it's a nice idea, but I really had some concerns that this is going to work. But I was actually proven wrong, and it seems to be really working well, because otherwise it wouldn't be picked up by so many different families, and it seems to be quite successful, unfortunately, even though it really requires a couple of different steps from a user perspective. Which on the other side, I guess, also helps us in detecting that, because I mean, there are some specific indicators that they are quite common across all of those paste checking or paste and run samples, and that also make the detection side at least a little bit easier, I think.
And sharing something too about being able to detonate these in a sandbox. I know like some folks up front kind of go, well, wait, how do I paste a command into a sandbox for me to be able to run some of it? And honestly, just putting the command that you would paste in into a batch script and submitting it to a sandbox has been 100% the best way that I could replicate this chain in a sandbox like VMRay, because it will bring up as much information in there as I could ask for.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we basically even, I think, in one of our last webinars, we also spoke about that paste checking campaigns, and VMRay also with, I think it was release version 2025.1, we also added support for official support for those paste checking attempts, which basically isn't doing much more than trying to also mimic a real user behavior when it comes to a URL analysis. So basically, considering you get an email with the URL that points to those pages, and whenever you open that and submit it, for example, to VMRay Sandbox platform, we basically also try to figure out and find those elements that would be clicked by a human, that threat actors are trying to interact the human with. And basically, we click those buttons, and then also we extract those commands that being put into the clipboard, and then also throw that into a recursive submission, like similar that you just mentioned, putting all of those data into a batch file and then just detonating it again into Sandbox. And this really brings you a lot of more visibility on what is going to happen and how this whole delivery chain looks like until the final stage is being dropped there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point around the visibility we get from different products. So we would like to understand the whole attack and the full story. So I think what you mentioned, Tony, around if the malware executes, right, that you can have visibility on the EDR side of things. But if not, probably it would be a good idea to bring in a sandbox and execute it there, right? So to combining
Absolutely.
these kind of visibilities is kind of good stuff, helpful.
Absolutely. And for folks that may not be familiar with what Red Canary does, we use a lot of EDR telemetry to do continuous monitoring and detection. And EDR, I like to tell people, is kind of a dual-edged sword in this manner of it does some really great things, some really awesome things to be able to detect malware in the wild. However, it also has that dual mission of stopping the malware in the wild, which is really awesome for EDR customers. However, if you're a threat intelligence person, it sometimes leaves you wanting a little bit more detail. And that's where the sandbox comes in. That's where, your EDR has to be performant. It's not going to tell you all of those file read operations. It's not going to tell you when the processor is queried for certain properties for anti-sandboxing, things like those. So that's where the sandboxes come in. That's absolutely where things like VMRay comes in for us to be able to work with those really high quality, high amounts of data from a sandbox report that actually lets us attribute specific malware families, even if they didn't fully execute on a system. We can run those on something where we know they'll execute and be able to figure out what they were.
Yeah, I think the also one of the very interesting differences between those two systems, and I really like this what you're saying, that basically they nearly have to come together, because like
Mhm.
if you want to have more enriched data, then basically you need a sandbox. But of course, having an EDR system installed on an end device is usually on the front line, basically. So you
Yeah,
get the samples, you get the fresh techniques that are being out there, and of course, then throwing them into sandbox gives you more visibility. And of course, then you have speed and time is another factor, right? So the
Mhm.
EDR needs to jump in as quick as possible, versus if you already throw it into a sandbox, then you basically have time, like a couple of minutes, to
Yes,
fully let this detonate, let this run, and get out the most IOCs that you basically can get from the analysis.
Yeah, when the topic
absolutely.
comes to EDRs, I think there is a lot to share. And I think recently I came across, I think a ransomware group shared a list of EDRs that they tested internally. So there were kind of some buzz around the effectiveness of that. But I think from this conversation, it can be understood clearly that there's a value there. But at the end of the day, for full visibility, of course, some other tools can come
Yeah.
into picture, and with different capabilities, right? So to complete the picture,
Absolutely.
is that the right? Yep. Okay.
And to complement that, I know organizations that have their own on-premises sandbox solution where they've bought something that's an on-premises sandbox. They still put an EDR sensor on their image that they use with that on-premises sandbox, so they can have an idea of here's the complete information that the sandbox gives us, plus what does the EDR cover in the middle of all of it. So there's definitely room to have both solutions. Both of them definitely serve their individual purposes. And of course, you never want to have to argue for the budget for both of them. However, they will both help every organization of at least a certain size that has to work with cybersecurity issues.
Definitely, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, cannot agree more. Let me bring my slides back. So actually, we have added more YARA rules to the platform. So I would like to speak a little bit about this. I hope you can see my slide around
Yes,
YARA
looks
rules.
We
good.
can.
Perfect. Thank you. So so we will stick with YARA for a second longer. So you can see here a list of malware families. I'm just looking at SecTopRat. I think that it was the last webinar that we shared a YARA rule around
Yes.
that. Tony, you
Yeah,
mentioned.
that's correct. We also added recently, I think in February, March, around the time, we also added a YARA signature for that family, which is interesting because now we're mentioning that also Hijackloader recently is dropping this quite often, and that's definitely interesting to see as well.
Yeah, and here you can see a few categories like info stealers, ransomware, rats, and even some other in the other category. There's some interesting stuff around. For example, the files created by Python tools like PyInstaller and the others. And if you remember from last month's webinar, again, we shared a pretty big batch of new YARA rules. So that work is not slowing down. It's good news, and we are still focusing hard on YARA. So now, quick pause here before we move on. Since RATs so have been a big part, remote access Trojans have been a big part of the updates lately, and well, we have seen significant activity actually and new behaviors around them. And here are some charts that I just got from Malware Bazaar for some prevalent ones. I want to open a little parenthesis and talk a bit more about RATs specifically, and hoping we can pull out some good takeaways connecting to the use of sandboxes and some specific powers like a malware config extraction. And at this moment, I would like to turn to Patrick. For all these families, these are a selection of the most popular ones. And we are adding YARA rules, we are updating config extractors. I would like to ask, are there any complexities around the analysis of RATs, like when it comes to possibly the classification
Well,
and the timing?
I really think this highly depends on what RAT you're talking about. I mean, you've picked up 4 of them here, and usually, I mean, that really depends, like things as JRAT, async-RAT, cursor-RAT, and similar ones, XWORM, I think, DC-RAT, however they're being called. I mean, there's a big list of them. I think they are usually quite simple because I think they are, if I'm not mistaken, nearly all of them are actually from forked versions from a root one, basically. So they're all very similar, which actually introduces interesting challenges, because if you really want to distinguish between those families, it's very challenging in writing proper YARA rules for them, because we have seen that already sometimes that, for example, the async RAT YARA maybe match on DC RAT or vice versa, basically. So this is getting a bit more tricky. But on the other side, though, when it comes to extracting the malware's configuration, that actually is a bit easier then, because all of them are actually following the same pattern and the same encryption logic. So that, yeah, it's sometimes it's easy, but it also introduces its unique challenges. And of course, I think one of the biggest challenges there as well is also keeping up with the forks. I mean, everyone can basically go to GitHub and look up them and create their own fork, make some adjustments, and maybe things are not going to work anymore as expected. So I think this is also one of the biggest challenges that we see with those leaked or published RATs.
Yeah, Tony, by the way, I will come to your research in a minute, but to Patrick, I would like to follow up, especially when it comes to why RATs. I mean, why is this, prevalence or popularity we see? Is it because, do you think it the role of them? I mean, the infected devices in DDoS attacks, for example. So it is kind of variety. So it is giving full access. It can be used in DDoS attacks.
Yeah.
So would that be the reason? Or
I guess maybe.
Do you expect any changes in the future, or the popularity will just be consistent?
Well, at least from my point, and I would then also like to maybe pass on to Tony because of his research that he did on RATs. But at least from
we will come to that.
everything connects to that, basically. But at least from my point of view, I think the number of RATs that we see is definitely not going down. I think this is always there as a background noise, and it's always quite active as well, anyways, because it has a lot of different use cases on why they basically use RATs. So of course, one thing that you've mentioned is maybe abusing devices for DDoS. You can build your whole botnet with that, but basically, whenever you infect devices with remote access Trojans, then you basically can control this device and you can use it at any time. So you can basically sell this access. You have this initial access brokers, I think they're being called. So they just focusing on trying to get into those machines and then selling the access there, basically. But of course, you have also different approaches, as you've mentioned, with abusing those machines for DDoS attacks and similar stuff. So I do really not expect that this is going down. I would think that this is either staying the same or maybe even is going to increase in the future.
All right. So I will bring back my slides and we will come to some interesting research. So here you can see a diagram. Speaking of RATs, so as you know, in recent webinars, we are sharing community note slides. So where we are sharing the, some takeaways, something useful, something actionable from reports from the community. And this time is a community note around reverse tunneling behavior of RATs. And now this research actually put out by Tony's team, and they looked at malware config extraction across a massive set, over 150,000, I suppose, samples, and building an entire pipeline to pivot on different indicators, and especially the tunneling behaviors. And I found this amazing, really. And Tony, would love for you to walk us through that research a bit and tell us how you approached. My first question: how you approached digging into that huge data set.
Absolutely. And to kind of give you an idea, this problem originated out of the need to chase malware families that don't necessarily produce good EDR detectable behaviors. So there are some families like async rat, NJRAT, and others. If they execute right, if an adversary implements them correctly, you will see a executable and a network connection. And that, in my opinion, the enemy of EDR has always been a random executable and a random network connection, because you have to have a lead to be able to get to know that that's malicious. And so that need to chase after those malware families kind of produced this research where we started ingesting a lot of NJRAT samples, async rat samples, KSAR rat, a bunch of different ones, XWorm, trying to figure out what common command and control infrastructure do they like talking to, so we could use those as indicators of compromise to be able to hunt for those and customers that we protect. And what we ended up finding was that there were some very interesting trends between different malware families and the samples that were made publicly available. And some of these are adversary choices. I have to make that clear, because if you download XWorm, if you download async rat, you can choose how you make your own command and control infrastructure. However, the adversaries that did this, they often liked using either dynamic DNS for their infrastructure, for their command and control. And if you're not familiar with dynamic DNS, this lets you basically use a dynamic IP address that you might have on like your home internet, your residential line, and assign a constant DNS name to it so that you can always specify that DNS name, come back to what your IP address is every time. If you're running async rat on your home network, you probably have some additional problems, but we'll go into that later. And then the other thing that we ended up seeing were the use of kind of these proxying tunneling services like playit.gg. I think that was one that was like a gaming service, ngrok type services, these sort of tunneling services that let you present applications from a private network to a public IP address. And as we started parsing those samples and pulling out configurations using sandbox configuration extractors, we started kind of seeing that adversaries like this sort of thing because it really lets them hide what their real infrastructure is behind the scenes. They start funneling all of that traffic through a trusted or a semi-trusted network that is not really associated with them personally, so that they could have that little bit of anonymity, that little bit of extra that little extra tier of being able to hide from real detection capabilities. And I love how you have this breakdown right in here. Uh,
Yeah,
in
we did
here we
our
have,
homework.
oh yeah, in the breakdown that we have here, we have our ply.gg domains. Those are the playit.gg tunneling service. Some of these are additional tunneling services. Some of them are dynamic DNS. If you don't have business uses for any of these domains, I would absolutely explore sinkholing them in enterprise environments, simply because if you don't have a business use for them, they're not going to be leading to good detection, or they're not going to be leading to good software. You're going to have malware that's trying to communicate with them. Now, the one that I would really caution people to research first before you do any sinkholing is that try Cloudflare one at the bottom with async.rat. The try Cloudflare one, that is part of the legitimate Cloudflare tunneling service. Again, if you use Cloudflare tunneling, your developers in your organization might. They will probably not be using the free Cloudflare tunneling service. If they are, then that might be some interesting things that you can talk through and work through with your developers, or you may be able to make exceptions for those developers. In reality, does, John in accounting need to be able to query trycloudflare.com and do all of the stuff like that? Do they have
Or
software that really needs to talk to that domain?
I think it can be a like business critical function that you wouldn't want to break, right?
Exactly. That very much can be it. That goes along with the entire concept of like knowing your environment. What software do you use? Being able to talk to your developers, talk to your people, and in some cases, you may even find some sort of shadow IT thing where someone has set up an application that nobody else knows about, and they've done it on free infrastructure. So now you get to figure out how you can support that better as an enterprise.
I think the try Cloudflare that you've mentioned, I think that's a pretty good point, because you maybe, if you really don't really need that service and you maybe can even block it. I think that's funny because you're not only trying to maybe block malicious files from communicating with the C2 servers, but I think we have also seen that quite a lot of phishing pages are being hosted on trycloudflare.com, or at least actually use those pages. So I also think that this is a pretty good, interesting point. And the other thing is, I'm always surprised by threat actors using dynamic DNS services. I mean, I don't really know. Well, I think we have seen only one legitimate application in the past years that basically really used the dynamic DNS servers for basically communicating with their services that the software needs. But I would also consider this as not fully, yeah, well, maybe it's a bad practice or not fully compliant with standards that you basically use, because I think for business purpose, dynamic DNS services are usually not really used or needed as far as I know. So definitely interesting to catch up on those DNS names being used in your environment.
In my experience, we have talked to a couple of organizations that have used them legitimately. In the cases where they did use them legitimately, these were organizations that had hardware resources, that had network connections on them in very remote parts of the world, and they had very little control over the network infrastructure, but they could connect them to a dynamic DNS service. But even then, they had a approved dynamic DNS service that they were supposed to use and not necessarily use the others.
Exactly.
Outside of that, when we see dynamic DNS used the most legitimately, it's usually when an employee at an enterprise tries to access their NAS at home, or something that they have at home that may or may not be supported by their enterprise, but they still would access from the enterprise system.
Well, but in that case, as you've mentioned, I guess you likely can come up with a list on basically what domains you basically expect to see in
Exactly.
your environment and your network, and everything else probably doesn't really has to be there basically.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's all about trying to get your exceptions, trying to get your allow list, block list right.
Yeah.
And talking about the lists, actually, there's a GitHub repo from MISP, so around dynamic DNS. So you can go ahead and check out, and just to help you, which of these really you're using internally, right? Before blocking outright all these ones. I mean, it's amazing, really. I think this is work in progress, right, Tony? And looking forward to really more comprehensive results.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we're still ingesting those indicators. We're still running after these malware families, and since we started this, we've also started doing additional malware families, which has been a very wonderful journey because we've had to make that process more resilient as the malware families have changed. And so uh, it's been wonderful kind of being able to experience that.
Amazing. So continuing on, so if you want to go ahead and see more, sandbox reports, I have two resources for our audience. One is our thread feed. Many of you might be aware of, but maybe you didn't have a chance to check out the full functionalities that you can, search for specific malware, like, for example, RATs, specific categories. You can filter out by sample type, or you can search, hash or URL on the portal. And another one, a new one at GitHub repo, where you can access IOCs only of specific malware. We recently built this out, so put out there. So it's gonna be improved, I hope, further. Let us know if you find it useful. Talking about malware config extraction, I think we have highlighted how valuable it can be, in your research based on a real need. So, I mean, it wouldn't be a real detection webinar without a demo. We can't miss that part. And of course, we can't skip talking about Luma, right? It's been very loud. And so Patrick, I will hand it over to you. You can just quickly walk through a report, right?
Yes, I can do that. If you may stop sharing your screen, then I can go ahead.
Sure.
So let me find the correct window here. Hope that's supposed to be this one. Okay. Yeah, so as we already talked about paste and run, paste checking or click fix, and also malware configuration extraction and the importance of it, let's connect to those points here. And well, we've basically picked up a Luma sample here that I would quickly like to go through the most relevant points of the analysis report. And I guess Tony also mentioned that he's heavily looking into Luma, so maybe you can also just jump in if you have any additional information and if you wanna extend it there as well. So, well, what we're looking here is the dynamic analysis report of VMRay platform here. We can immediately see we are talking about a malicious sample. We see here a classification as spyware, and classification in that terms here basically means that's the type of the malware that we see here. I mean, Luma is stealer, is spyware, so that's meant with the classification here. But of course, we also have the threat names, and just by the first look, you immediately can see that this is being identified to be a Luma sample. There's also a bunch of different threat names that are coming from integration services that we have also in the sandbox, just to ensure you get the most out of it and the best detection. There is a antivirus system being used in the background, and of course, we also use a couple of different reputation services here. When looking down, you see the VMRay threat identifier, so in short VTIs that Ertuğ already mentioned at the very beginning of this webinar. We're just going to extend this a little bit here. You can see we have in total 34 rules matching here in this Luma sample, and just trying to explain and describe what this sample is doing during its execution. And I think the top three of them, that's also got a high score with 5 out of 5. Are already explaining a lot of those things. So I will just start from the bottom here. We have the data collection VTI that just tells you that a couple of those processes we see here are attempting to either capture keystrokes, taking screenshots, and of course then trying to exfiltrate this data, which matches with this classification of a spyware. We know Luma is a stealer basically. On the top here, we see the YARA match, or the YARA matches. In that case, we have a couple of matches here for function strings. That's pretty unique to VMRay. So basically, when you execute a sample, at a certain point, this file needs to interact with the Windows API. And the sample can be, we all know that, pretty much encrypted. The strings are encrypted. The code might be obfuscated. But at a specific point when API calls are being made, specific strings have to be there in plain text. And that's basically what we are extracting with our function strings. Whenever you see an interaction with Windows API, if there's any kind of readable string in that or a buffer that contains readable strings, we extract this, and that's also pretty good for YARA rules because it's pretty reliable against code changes. And with one of the most recent updates, that's something I guess I'm going to spoil right now here because that's probably part of the next webinar of May. But anyways, we're already looking into this here, so why not?
Feel free to spoil.
It's a preview.
Yes, something that's that came fresh out of the bakery. I think we released those changes today morning. We do have a new YARA signature for the Luma samples that we have seen, I think, earlier that year that use the Chacha cipher for the string encryption. So we can also capture those samples right now with code-based YARA signatures. And finally, we also basically updated the config extractor for Luma so that we really can pull out the C2 servers from the most recent samples as well. So just going down a bit here, just taking a quick look here, you see we've talked about that, how relevant the malware configuration extraction is, how relevant the C2 URLs are basically for a sample. With the update to the config extractor, we basically get all of them out of the samples, which I think is also very important because, I mean, considering Luma here uses quite a set of different C2 domains, C2 URLs. And for example, if you execute those samples regularly in the sandbox, you may not see all of them because usually maybe it's probably only connecting to one, but there are still 7, 6, 7, 8 more of them that you usually don't really know. And I think this is also the point where malware configuration extraction is coming into place here, so you can really get all of this data out of the analysis and of those samples. And well, then you can use those data, you can further process them and basically start blocking, doing some hunting, and so on and so forth. If we basically continue looking a bit through the report here, we see a bunch of different VTIs. One interesting one I always like to highlight is the anti-analysis topic here when it comes to indirect system calls. I think Luma seems to be one of those families that use those indirect system calls. We just look a bit through the sort of APIs that are being used here. We have the create section, open section, unmap section, all seems to be a bit related to maybe some injection or similar techniques. I think that's quite interesting because I usually, when we talk about evasive samples, then I usually group them into two categories, basically. I think there's one of those groups is that simply try to figure out whether are we running in a sandbox? Is there some evidence that we maybe should pause and stop the execution? And then, of course, we have the other side that says, well, I don't really care if I'm running in a sandbox. I'm just trying to make the execution flow as obscure as possible, doing some obfuscation there as well, and just trying to slip below the monitoring, basically. So I still execute, but I just try to basically stay hidden there. And I think Luma is one of them. We know Hijackloader, I think even Picabot in the past also used similar techniques.
Yeah, I could definitely see like those malware families that have that wider distribution that are the numbers games. I could definitely see them going after that strategy of, hey, we know that researchers are going to come after us. We know that we're going to run in sandboxes, but hey, for every one that we get in a sandbox, we'll have 10 more on real systems.
Exactly. Yeah. And actually, I think that this is also a bit of an uptrend from my point of view, that those kind of say, well, I don't really care if we're running in a sandbox because I mean, we know that this is going to happen, but we just try to stay hidden, basically. And an interesting fact is that a lot of those techniques are actually being used by being taken from like GitHub projects where researchers and red teamers basically put them out. I think those ideas of indirect system calls that came with the SysWhispers frameworks in the past. I mean, it's publicly available, and I think usually threat actors are also, depending on who you're basically talking about, but some of them are also pretty lazy and say, well, I mean, if there is a working research or working project out there, so why not just pulling this into our own development and just well, use it if it's going to be if it's going to work or if it's being successful. Yeah. Yep, and finally, just to wrap that up, we have, of course, a bunch of more VTIs here. As mentioned before, we see the data collection, the attempt to basically take screenshots, trying to exfiltrate data from the clipboard. And also one thing that we recently added, and I think there we are going a bit back into this capability YARA rules, kind of. Is also some generic YARA rules that we usually see when it comes to stealing behavior. I mean, there is quite a well list of, for example, crypto wallet IDs, the extension IDs for Chrome, for example. There are usually generic files that a lot of stealers have in common that they're going to drop to the disk before they're trying to exfiltrate them. It's like the password.txt file and similar stuff. And we also looked a bit into that area and tried to come up with some more generic YARA signatures that really indicate that there is something inside of this analysis going on that seems to be highly related to some stealing capabilities and stealing behaviors. And we discussed it before, and Tony, I think, mentioned it. It's also very useful, basically, because you can also explore some sort of unknown families yet that you basically don't really know which family it is, but you see those sort of YARAs triggering. That gives you some clues that this could be related to any sort of spyware, of stealer, and similar things. And yeah, just rounds up the analysis report. Besides those VTIs, we see here some discovery stuff, and of course, then going down to the informative VTIs that you really understand what's happening. Well, and last point to highlight here is maybe the persistence as well. In this case, Luma seems to try to add itself to the Windows registry, basically, or to the startup by Windows registry. And this is also something that we usually track. And based on this, we also usually initiate a reboot of the virtual machine, just to really be able to analyze also the behavior that is going to be triggered by this persistence mechanism. I think we have seen some specific families in the past that whenever you execute them, they basically just try to get persistence on the machine. And only in case you basically reboot or there's a specific user logging in, the behavior being installed by this persistence is kicking off. And to really ensure you basically get all of that stuff out, of course, also go with the reboot here. And all of that information you really just get out of a sandbox report in a couple of minutes, depending on how deep you want to go in. Of course, sometimes 2 minutes is enough. Sometimes you want to have a 5 minutes analysis, depending on the resource intensive execution of samples you have. And then you basically can use all of this information for further processing or nice research projects, as Tony did with the C2 domains. With that being said, I think that at least rounds up the demo part here.
Amazing. It was a great demo. Thanks, Patrick. And I need to take it back right now to wrap it up. So that was fast, I would say. And I think it was a really packed session today. So we hit on a lot, and latest threats, paste and run, the hijack loader, RATs, and of course following with a great demo and great conversation. So huge thanks to Tony for joining and sharing insights from the field. Really awesome to have that outside perspective with visibility.
Yeah, it was really great.
Always welcome. And now let me check if we have any questions before I leave you free, guys. So yes, we have questions. I think this is for Tony. The project is still growing, as you said. Are there any early trends you are already seeing? Or I think you kind of partially answered that one, but would you do that with other malware other than rats?
Absolutely. I would do this. Sorry, I'm passionate about this part. So I would absolutely do it with malware other than rats. I would do it with additional anything that you can have a configuration extracted from. So stealers, any sort of things like that, because anytime you can do trend tracking with adversary infrastructure, you can absolutely find some sort of trend that helps you predict how they might behave in the future, or help your organization make good decisions. Different things like those. A good example of this, the configuration extractors for Luma. Every time I end up seeing those Luma domains, they help me kind of confirm, like, hey, what are the DNS registrars that the adversaries that use Luma use? How do they do their DNS things? Who do they host their web services through? Turns out they may be protected by Cloudflare with these URLs, different things like those. So anywhere that you can pull those configurations out, they are always going to be helpful, and they're always going to be worth tracking over a long tail, simply because that helps you make better decisions as an organization and as a security apparatus.
Amazing.
Definitely interesting, yeah.
another one, I think this is for Tony as well. Is there anything you think EDR still struggle to catch, even when attackers, even if they are noisy?
So I don't know that it's necessarily struggling to catch as much as struggling to represent accurately. And process injection is still something that ADR can go after very well. It can still catch it very well. But one of the problems that I see on a weekly basis is that ADR will say, hey, something has been injected into this process. And us as defenders know that there's been an injection into that process, but we still don't have a good idea of what malware family has been injected. We don't necessarily know, how to inform our response based on that process injection. So a good example of this, going back to Luma, because I look at Luma a lot, and a lot of the paste and run things, the click fixes that we see, we will see a PowerShell process that has Luma injected into it. The only indicator that Luma is the malware running inside that PowerShell process might be the actual command and control domain that is communicated with that EDR will capture. And at that point, EDR has to be performant. It has to be able to move fast. So it may not have everything in it to detect that Luma is executing inside that memory space. So that is something that defenders have to make up the difference for, where, yes, the EDR detects, but the defender is the one that actually protects and goes after like responding in that organization to help bring things back to normal.
Thank you, Tony. Great insights
No
again.
problem.
And the last one, I think, for Patrick, do you have an API for threat feed portal?
No, actually, we do not have an API for the threatfeed.vmray.com. That's really just more or less for manual interaction and playing around with our reports. But we are currently actually working on a project for ATI feed, which is basically, I think, it's in development, and that, of course, something you can access then via API. So if you're interested into trying out VMRay's data that can be provided by VMRay, then of course feel free to ping us, and I think we can definitely go into some discussions.
Yeah, amazing. So, any thoughts, Tony, Patrick, and any remarks that you wanna? We're good. All right.
Oh, I think I think we should do this again. It was a great webinar.
That's it.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is always a fun experience for me to be able to come and talk about malware with people, because my family don't react quite the same when I talk about malware with them. So this is always a fun experience.
Yeah, amazing. Amazing to have you guys again. And our next webinar will be scheduled for May 21st. So mark your calendars. And again, huge thanks, Patrick, Tony, and thank you everybody for joining this one. Yeah, see you next time. Adios.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.